Good morning, everyone. and Obviously, a lot is going on here, so let me get right into it. We are now on day 6 on President Trump's war of choice against Iran. Let me say at the outset, obviously, I'm going to shed no tears over the deaths of the Iranian leadership. The leadership and the regime has been awful to the 92 million Iranians, but also a enormously anti-American, anti-Israeli. But it still begs the question of why now and why during this time frame. So far, we've seen from the administration 4 different answers on why this war of choice was started. First, it was supposed to be about the Iranian nuclear capabilities that the president bragged had been completely obliterated last June. Obviously, they weren't obliterated. Second, it was about the growing challenge of Iran's ballistic missiles. And yes, that is a growing concern, but there was no imminent threat to the United States, for that matter, even an imminent, immediate threat to Israel. Then there is the concern about the Iranian Navy, which I only heard in the last briefing. And then there's been the on and off about a regime change. The question I have, the president has asked for the Iranian people to take back their government, but if the Iranian people show up with 100,000 protesters in Tehran, Iran's capital, and the Iranian Republican Guard, the military, kill 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 of them, does America have obligation to go in and protect those protesters? We don't have an answer on that. I've also been particularly concerned about so many of our sailors who are in now the conflict zone, who are home ported out of Norfolk. I think about the Gerald Ford, our largest carrier that is now approaching month 9 of its deployment. Originally was going to go to the Mediterranean, then it was sent to Venezuela, now it's back to the Mediterranean. And I heard on Sunday when I was in Virginia Beach and Norfolk and Chesapeake from friends and family members of those sailors who are deeply concerned about when their loved ones are going to get back, how much danger there's in, and what is the purpose of this war. We know the administration has acknowledged that it is going to be weeks and maybe months more, and I still don't believe there is a clear purpose. It was one of the reasons why I voted yesterday for Tim Kaine's War Powers Resolution. If the president is choosing to take our nation to war, the president ought to come to the American public and the Congress and ask for a declaration of war and make the case. He has not done so. I'd also point out, and while our focus should appropriately be on our fellow Virginians who are in harm's way or the 6 service members who've been killed in the conflict, and with the expectation of more casualties to come, again, the president and the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth's own words, we also need to look at the cost. We don't have any estimate of the amount of cost of this war. We do know that, for example, every Tomahawk missile that's fired costs about $2.4 million, that it has cost close to $1 billion to assemble the forces in the region. And again, this is a choice. This is an administration that chose not to fund health care for millions of Americans in terms of the tax credits. This is an administration that's chosen to cut Medicaid, although most of those cuts won't take place until after the elections. Administrations that's dramatically cut back on food assistance for needy families. This is an administration that's dramatically cut back on research and development. So the question of how large will this bill be and what other domestic programs will have to be cut to pay for these bills is unknown at this point. And again, I remind people this was the president who was going to get us out of endless wars in the Middle East And if there's one thing we should have learned from the last 30 years, it's a lot easier to get yourself into a war in the Middle East than it is to get yourself out of a war in the Middle East. So with that, why don't I turn it over to Catherine and be happy to take your questions.
Senator, the first question is from Mitchell with WTOP.
Hi, Senator. Thanks a lot for joining us this morning. I have a two-part question related to some of the things you just touched on related to Iran. Defense industry officials are going to meet with the president tomorrow, and amid these reports of possible munitions and interceptor shortages as the war keeps going, what concerns, if any, do you have about that possibility? And related to the cost, do you think Congress will be willing to come up with a military supplemental related to the overall war effort?
Well, we've seen a drawdown of our munitions, not just because of, for example, our strikes against the Houthis, but this president, I think, has had 7 military interventions, including Nigeria, including Venezuela, including Syria, Iraq. And so we have to increase our defense industrial base. But it is clear that while the administration is saying they've got enough immediate bombs itself, some of the other interceptors, should the Iranians, shoot more at us, those are low. If the president is going to ask for a supplemental, I'm sure we'll take a look at it. But again, this is all about choices. I wish the president would also come back with a supplemental saying, we need to actually return health care to the millions of Americans who've lost it. We will take a look at his request, but there needs to be clarity on what the goals are of this war and how long it's going to take. We do control the skies over Iran at this point, but I don't know how, with a bombing campaign only, you meet all of even the goals the president's outlined, like getting rid of all of Iran's military industrial base. I don't know if you can do that with a bombing-only effort, and I think the overwhelming majority of Americans do not want boots on the ground, and I'll point out the president has not ruled that out.
The next question is from Tom with Fox 5. Tom, are you there? Okay, our next question is from Audra with Sinclair Broadcast Group.
Thanks, Senator. I appreciate you staying consistently available, even as this is unfolding. We're closely tracking the impact on gas prices, up 27 cents from a week ago. First, as news reporting is suggesting this morning, from what you've seen, do you believe the administration's planning for this war to last at least through September? And then, obviously, the impact on drivers would be devastating if that happens. As the president says he wants to do, is it even feasible for the U.S. Navy to escort tankers through the Strait of Hormuz? Thank you.
We've known that the narrowness of the Straits of Hormuz makes it very easy to block, or the Iranians could even sink some of their own vessels there to cut off those straits, which would, in many ways cripple the energy supplies, not just for America, but for countries around the region. We've already seen, as you said, gas prices go up 27 cents. As we get into the spring and summer season, that's going to really provide a major hit on Americans' pocketbooks. That, combined with the fact that the inflation numbers are coming in higher. This is a president that is not focused on affordability, no matter how many times the White House tries to send him out on this subject. He has no record of affordability. I pray that this war will not last till the fall. I've not heard any projection that far in advance. But if we don't have a clear set of goals, when do we declare victory? Is this going to be simply when the president gets tired of the war, or when gas prices get too high? I still continue to worry that we don't have the level of support from our allies that we normally would, and that has the potential to prolong the conflict as well. So I think Americans are going to see the price at the pump rise dramatically, and it'll get much worse if the Straits of Hormuz are closed. And I have not heard of any reasonable plan where you could have escorts of these tankers, particularly through that narrow stretch of sea. I'm open to somebody convincing me, but I've not seen anybody rationally propose that kind of a workable situation.
The next question is from Jada with ABC 13.
Hi, Senator Warner. I have a question pertaining to ICE. So Governor Spanberger is telling ICE they need to obtain judicial warrants to detain illegal aliens, but we recently had a case here in Virginia where an illegal immigrant with an extensive and violent criminal history has been released back into the community several times due to this rule and is now stabbed and killed another woman. In cases like this, where is the line, and should Virginia cooperate with ICE more freely in order to protect the lives of Americans?
Well, listen, of course, if someone has a history of violent crime, they should be arrested and deported if they're here illegally. But I'll point out that over 80% of the individuals that have been picked up by ICE in Virginia as they try to hit their daily quotas have had no criminal history or record other than coming into our country. And many of them, even having come in undocumented, were going through a process that would bring about legal status. So they're trying to play by whether the amnesty rules or other rules who are put forward. I think ICE needs to be reformed. I would welcome, though, the chance to go ahead and fully fund TSA, fully fund the Coast Guard, fully fund the cybersecurity agency, all the other entities, and still negotiate about reforms with ICE. But I, for one, have always felt that someone who has got a long-term criminal record, they deserve to be deported. But the overwhelming majority don't fit that category at all.
The next question is from Ashley with Wavy.
Hi, Senator. Thank you for taking questions. I had a question going back to the War Powers resolution, and we know the Senate voted against it yesterday. The House votes on it today. We've heard from Republicans saying that presidents on both sides have taken advantage of Article 2 powers of the War Powers Act of 1973 and do similar things where, whether it was Obama and his actions in Libya or Biden and the attacks in Yemen. Explain how you believe this is a different scenario from either of those.
Obama, Biden, Trump in his first term have used Article 2 powers. They have almost always been the United States responding to a provocative action by a different country. In this case, this is a war of choice. There was no imminent threat from Iran against America. There was no attack by Iran against America. The president built up these forces over a series of months. And when you have a war of choice, the president can make that case, but the president is obligated to come to the Congress and come to the American people and make the case and get approval. I think there is an enormous distinction, and I've heard Republicans and Democrats both use when you are responding to another action, the president is given a little more leeway. When you plan for months a war and your adversary does not strike America or even pose an imminent threat, then I absolutely believe the president has to seek approval of Congress.
The next question is from Ben with WRIC.
Hello, Senator. Thanks for answering our questions. ABC was reporting that tens of thousands are still abroad, and even Senator Kaine was saying that Virginians have contacted his office trying to get back home. Have any Virginians contacted your office who are stranded at airports across the world? How many have gotten in touch with your office? Where are they coming from? Have you been able to give them any answers or any comfort that they'll be coming back to the States anytime soon?
Yeah.
Have any Senate colleagues talked with you, or do you know about how many Americans in general are still abroad?
The number that's still abroad in that region are in the thousands. Many of them, for example, dual citizens in Israel. But in terms of travelers, my office has been overwhelmed with calls coming in. I think it's in the hundreds now, many who are stuck in Dubai or stuck in Doha, who are not even going through the region, but they were simply, those are transit flights that were going from America, and they might be headed to Asia or elsewhere around the world, and they land on a transit flight and are stuck there. This is one of the things that, again, baffles me. We knew this was coming. The president, working with Israel, chose the time to launch this. Why wasn't there a better plan put in place to get Americans out? And the remarkable thing is, other nations, European nations, it appears to have done a better job of getting their nationals out of the region. And we're told to call a phone number at the State Department that oftentimes is busy and doesn't have much information. Secretary Rubio did indicate in a briefing, I believe yesterday, that they were trying to fly more planes into the region to get folks out. But again, when you choose the time and place to start a war, you would think that someone would have thought about, well, we got hundreds of thousands of Americans in the Middle East. We ought to plan in advance to either get them out before the war starts or have plenty of planes available to get them out once the conflict is started. Unfortunately, as we've seen so many times with this administration, they're not great on the details.
The next question is from Angela with Hampton Roads Messenger.
Good morning, Senator. Thank you for taking my question. I actually have two questions that I hope you can answer. My first one is, do you know if there's anything special that can be done to support the families of the USS Gerald Ford? For instance, some of the spouses have had to act as single parents for more than 250 days and counting. Is there anything that can be done to further support these families? And my second question is there a downside to eliminating the religious leader of Iran?
Great questions. On the first, I talked to a Navy mom on Sunday with 4 kids under 10 who were trying to explain to her kids why their dad wasn't coming home at the end of February, who was on the Ford. There are, in Hampton Roads, a number of military support groups. It's a good question about for the Ford specifically, where we should direct assistance to. I'll get that and post it on my website. But there are a whole host of support organizations in Hampton Roads, and I worry about those sailors. I mean, they'll do their duty, and this mom told me she's a reservist. She'll do her duty. But we're now, as you said, over 250 days. I hear reports that the toilets aren't working that well, the stress that's being put on these sailors. And I heard the stress as well when I was in Hampton Roads on Sunday, in Norfolk, in Virginia Beach, in Chesapeake. Every meeting I was at least half the people at the meeting had loved ones or new folks who are deployed at this point. So that has a stress on the community, has a stress on the family, and obviously has a stress on the sailors who've been deployed. In terms of killing the religious leader, the supreme leader, this is a guy who had American blood on his hands. I will shed no tears for his demise. But I would point out that as bad as he was, he had put some limits on weaponizing Iran's nuclear program. we don't know who's coming next. The one thing that we did know is that, because we didn't have great visibility into the Iranian resistance, that there was a high probability that we might end up with someone that was even worse than the Ayatollah. So we will see as times go on. This is, again, why, if you're going to launch a war of choice, you got to make the case. And since we don't have, since the president has offended so many of our allies, many of those allies who might have better visibility into the Iranian resistance and a better idea on what's coming next, and I'm not sure we got all that information.
The next question is from Jim with the Virginia Mercury.
Senator, it's Jim Spencer. Thanks so much for taking my question. So Donald Trump has a pattern of ignoring the Constitution to do whatever he wants. He did it with the Iranian war. He did it with due process with ICE. And he's done it now with the tariffs that the Supreme Court knocked down. Why can't Congress hold him accountable for the pattern of behavior? What he does is he does things whatever he wants, and then you can't get him to undo them. Because some of it has been done already, and in other cases, he won't make things right, even if he's held culpable by the Supreme Court.
Well, Jim, the simple answer to your question is there are too many Republicans who are still too afraid of Donald Trump to do their, what I believe is constitutional duty. And it's amazing to me the number of my Republican friends who keep saying, oh, Mark, you're right, but then they don't vote that way. And when I say they aren't doing their constitutional duty, even if they agree with the president, they ought to exercise Article 1 powers and ask the president, for example, in the case of the war, to come and make the case. They can vote for the war if they want to, but have him at least make the case. Or in the case of tariffs, they've all quietly complained. But we were only able, on the basis of Tim Kaine's good work, pass one resolution around the Canadian tariffs. We should have passed more. My fear is, and Jim, I appreciate you followed this for a long time, when Congress continues to cede power to a chief executive who ignores the law, ignores norms, has a level of just frankly crudeness and threatening to his supporters and foes alike, it really diminishes America, diminishes Americans' trust in their government and institutions, and frankly diminishes our allies' willingness to help us around the world. Some of the numbers on how America is viewed now are at record lows, and a lot of that is due to Trump's America-only policy, which oftentimes is turned into America alone, which does not make America safer. I can promise you that.
Senator, our final question is from Tim with CBS 19.
Hi, Senator. Thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. Obviously, you've been very vocal about what's been going on in Iran and how you believe there needs to be more checks and balances on the president. Obviously, Virginians will be voting on redistricting this coming April. Do you think the redistricting will help with that?
Listen, I think the only reason we're having this referendum is because the president started mid-decade redistricting in Texas and also in North Carolina for purely political reasons. But unlike Texas and North Carolina, where the politicians made all the decisions, in Virginia, the voters are going to decide whether we want to take a temporary part-time or temporary pause, redistrict, going back to nonpartisan at the end, at 2030 when the next census. I think it makes sense to try to balance out some of the other mid-decade redistricting done by the president. But at the end of the day, Virginians are going to be able to make that choice, not politicians.
Senator, those were all the questions we had today.
Thanks so much, everybody.